Hello, everyone. It's about 2 minutes to, so we'll start then, just so people aren't saying, what the hell, why'd you start early? I'm sure they would be torn up about that. So just for clarification, I'm not, somebody here said that two atheists talking about Christianity. I'm not talking to Cosmic Skeptic. It'd be nice to talk to him in the future, but for today I'm just reviewing a video of his. I'm going to be annotating it, and we're going to be looking at the actual arguments after the fact. So, good, I'm glad you like these note videos. I like them too. I'm finding that one of the major benefits that I get from doing this channel, because obviously it's not monetary, is that it forces me, especially during COVID, to actually like dig deep into my research and sort of like interrogate things that I've sort of taken for granted philosophically and politically, and like really, fill in those gaps. With respect to these, I like these a lot because I'm finding they really help me focus a lot better on arguments that I'm listening to, because I actually have to pay like constant and close attention to get these notes down. So it's actually been really psychologically beneficial for me. I found that my attention span just in these past couple of videos has gone way up, which has been great. So I'm glad you like it. I like it too. And yeah, for the record, I'm not an atheist. So, and in any case, why would it matter if two atheists were talking about Christianity? Christianity is an extremely important part of our historical heritage. There's no getting around it. Atheists absolutely have a very good reason to think about it and to discuss it. You don't have to like adhere to a creed in order to recognize that it has historical and political importance, right? Or even philosophical importance. So, okay, it's 12:30 now. So yeah, so we'll just get right into it. So again, just for people who just showed up, the format of this video is I will watch the video in real time. I will not pause it unless I absolutely need to. This one's shorter, so that's less of a problem. With the longer debates, I don't pause them because they go on over an hour sometimes, and we'll be here all day, and I frankly just don't have the energy for it. But with this one, this is, I think, something to the tune of like 20 or so minutes. That's fine. As it's playing, I will be annotating it on the side so we see exactly what the arguments are. And then at the end, I'll return to these and we'll see what we think. So I hope that makes sense. Anyways, without further ado, let us begin. Let's make sure the volume's up. Let me know if you guys can't hear this.
Too. But anyway, let's get on with today's video. Now, I know that it's quite a bold claim that I've made in the title to have put my finger on the single biggest problem that Christianity as a religion faces. But let me explain. I want to put forward in this video what I think is the hardest objection to respond to if you're a Christian. Now, as you'll probably already know, the most famous problem that you have if you want to say that the Christian God, that is, an all-loving, all-powerful God, exists, is the positively colossal amount of suffering infused into the human experience. Suffering is so omnipresent that most of our time spent existing is time spent trying to avoid it. Eating to avoid starvation, working to avoid poverty, sleeping to avoid fatigue, watching YouTube videos to avoid whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing right now. And that's when things are going well in life. God also throws into the bargain of living existence, which nobody agrees to enter into, by the way, unpredictable diseases, miscarriages, natural disasters, and the existence of TikTok. Why would an all-powerful God, who truly loves us, permit such suffering to overwhelm our living existence? And this problem for religion is called, as you'll likely know, the problem of evil. But there's something missing from this picture. I'm not just here to restate the problem of evil as if it's anything new. There's something else. There exists such an obvious and overwhelming version of the problem of evil that it bemuses me that so many philosophers leave it entirely out of the discussion, or at best relegate it to a passing paragraph or a footnote or something. I'm talking, of course, about the problem of animal suffering. Now, before you think I'm just getting all vegan on you again, don't worry, that's not what this is. I know how sensitive some of you are to me pointing out that our own treatment of animals is so poor that it almost reaches godlike proportions, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. Right? Animals suffering in factory farms, for instance, can easily be explained away by the Christian as a result of human free will. I'm talking about something else. Right? I'm talking about the suffering of animals that isn't human created. The suffering that exists in the wild as a result of natural processes. And by the way, the reason this video is called Christianity's biggest problem specifically, rather than just religion's biggest problem, is because I actually think that some other religions, like Islam, have bigger problems than animal suffering. But animal suffering is still a problem for other religions like Islam, so although in this video I'm going to respond to William Lane Craig, a Christian, on the subject, do bear in mind that these arguments should apply to any God who claims to be morally perfect. So this is the basis of my claim. If the problem of suffering is historically one of Christianity's biggest problems, then the problem of animal suffering is its biggest. So I should probably begin by unpacking why animal suffering is such a problem worth addressing in the first place. If human life is, as I've argued, infused with pain, then non-human animal life is defined by pain. Animals in the wild are subject to endless torment from all angles of their existence. They suffer from predation by other animals. Wild dogs disembowel their prey. Venomous snakes cause slow internal bleeding and paralysis. Crocodiles drown large animals in their jaws. And animals also suffer from rampant disease, dehydration, and starvation. They have to contend with forest fires and floods and a whole manner of other terrifying natural disasters. David Attenborough, the celebrated nature documentary filmmaker, once said about his documentaries, "People who accuse us of putting in too much violence should see what we leave on the cutting room floor." Nature just really isn't a pretty place, and not only do wild animals suffer in these extravagant ways that humans generally do not, like having to live with the very real possibility of being mauled to death at practically any moment, it's also true that compared to humans, an astronomically higher number of wild animals exist. So unfathomably high, in fact, that we can only estimate how big that number actually is. The number of wild vertebrates alone is thought to be somewhere between 10 to the power of 11 and 10 to the power of 14. That's 10 with at least 11 zeros after it. We're talking trillions of animals, each one of whom will, under the unerring supervision of an all-powerful, all-loving God, likely experience more fear, devastation, and suffering in their lifetimes than we human beings are even capable of imagining. So this is the problem that the Christian has to contend with. How can God permit such insidious levels of unthinkable suffering? Well, it's not like Christians don't have a response to the problem of evil. There are many quite famous attempts to reconcile the existence of evil with a loving God. The problem is that a great many of these attempts, which are known as theodicies, by the way, simply don't apply to non-humans. For instance, one popular theodicy states that evil and suffering exists as a result of human free will. Right? If humans are genuinely free, they'll sometimes commit and permit evil. But this doesn't explain why a tree falls onto a deer's leg, causing it to starve to death in confused agony. Right? It's also sometimes asserted that human suffering is justified because it will be compensated for in the afterlife. But unless you believe in some doggy heaven, or that Jesus died for the sake of your pet hamster's sins too, this also doesn't really fly for animals. It's also sometimes said that suffering exists because from it more good can emerge. But what good emerges from animal suffering? And how does it benefit the animals? Most animals are non-rational creatures. They can't learn and intellectually grow in the same way that humans can. What greater good could possibly be served by allowing a koala bear to be burned alive in an Australian wildfire? Well, fear not, because in 2011, two very eloquent philosophers, Stephen Law and William Lane Craig, both previous guests on this channel, by the way, debated God's existence. Dr. Law brings up the problem of animal suffering, and so we can now turn our attention to what Dr. Craig, often cited as Christianity's greatest public defender, has to say about it.
Now, let me say one more thing about animal predation and suffering, since this featured largely in his argument. Number one, animals are part of a broader ecosystem in which the human drama is played out. And such an ecosystem must be balanced if it's to be viable. It is no accident that every ecosystem involves predators of some sort. For example, I also recently saw a program on television about how the Canadian authorities are reintroducing wolves into the wild in Canada. Why? because in the absence of these predators, the caribou herds were overpopulating because there was no one to pick off the diseased and the aged, and as a result, they were overgrazing and therefore dying of starvation. The predators actually enhanced the survivability and the health of the caribou herds on which they preyed.
Okay, so Craig's argument is this. If an ecosystem is unbalanced, leading to an overpopulation of prey, this prey will die from starvation since there won't be enough food to go around. By ensuring that predators exist to pick off the diseased and the aged, the ecosystem is balanced, preventing that starvation. But there are just a multitude of problems with this, right? First, it's of course true that in practice, any functional ecosystem we know of requires predators and prey in order to be balanced. But why does this need to be true in principle? Right, the laws of ecosystems, as they stand, require predation, but are we expected to believe that God couldn't have made these laws differently? Is God constrained by these laws? That's the implication of saying that an ecosystem must be balanced in this way, that God couldn't have created a balanced ecosystem using other, less painful methods. In other words, the laws of ecosystems somehow constrain what God is able to do. Are we really to think that the laws of ecosystems are more fundamental than God is? No, God is the creator of the laws of ecosystems, and so can't be bound by them. And besides, granting that God does need to balance an ecosystem, predation is not the only way to do it. God could have, for example, limited the number of times an animal can reproduce as a way of preventing overpopulation, a form of cosmic contraception. There's definitely a joke about a condom brand in there somewhere. But no, for Dr. Craig, God limiting an animal's sexual potency or any other kinds of painless methods are not possible options for combating overpopulation. No, the only way that God can save these animals from overpopulating and starving to death is to introduce savage predators who maul them to death in some of the most painful ways humanly imaginable. That's the only way to balance the ecosystem. I mean, come on. When a lion kills a zebra, the zebra is usually too large to be killed instantly, and so is often asphyxiated to death, writhing in pain over a slow, minutes-long death. I mean, even if predation really is the only way to stabilize an ecosystem, there's still absolutely no reason why it would need to be so painful and so gruesome. God could provide for these animals an instant death, or at least one that's less painful. But he doesn't. He allows that zebra to suffer for minutes whilst its windpipe is caught in the jaws of a lion. Just imagine for a moment what it must feel like to be that zebra. None of this is necessary for ecosystem stability if you truly are the omnipotent creator of natural laws. And Dr. Craig is arguing that predation is justified since it prevents prey from starving to death. But is the fate of being preyed upon and eaten alive really that much better than starvation? Would you, given the choice, rather die from a lack of food or from being painfully mauled to death by a large wild animal? I'm not sure I have a particular favourite. It's hardly a merciful deal that's being offered here. God is so loving that he saves these animals from starving by ensuring that they're ripped open and eaten alive before they have the chance to starve. Wow, what a glorious and loving thing that God does for these animals. And why should these animals even be suffering from so much starvation in the first place? That still needs to be explained. And also, bear in mind that predation doesn't even get rid of starvation, just some starvation. Even with predators, there are still animals starving to death in the wild. And so if the reason that God created predators was to save prey from starving to death, why are some animals still allowed to go on starving to death anyway? None of this makes any sense. And on top of even that, note that the same justification that Dr. Craig is using here could also apply to human beings. There are currently millions of human beings lacking food and at risk of famine in South Sudan. And starvation is one of the most painful things that a person can go through. But don't worry, I have an idea. Let's go to South Sudan and introduce some wild predators, maybe some wolves or some large bears to painfully maul these people to death. After all, if we didn't do this, they'd all starve. By allowing them to be preyed upon by wild animals to pick off the diseased and the aged, we reduce their numbers and balance out the ecosystem, leaving more food to go around and minimizing starvation. How merciful of us. So who's for it? Yeah, I didn't think so. Now, okay, you may think that I'm being a bit unfair here, right? There are obviously many other methods we can use to reduce starvation in South Sudan that don't involve killing people with wild predators. But yeah, that's kind of the point, right? If we humans have the power to reduce human starvation without necessitating them being mauled to death by wolves, then you can bet that God has the power to reduce elk starvation without necessitating them being mauled to death by wolves. The idea that permitting this kind of unthinkably painful death is the only way to prevent them from starving if you are the omnipotent creator of the universe verges on one of the most ridiculous things that I have ever heard.
So that predators are an essential part of an ecosystem. In a world without predators, the insects would soon take over, since there would be nothing to eat them, and all the animals would soon die because all the vegetation would be consumed by insects.
Once again, Dr. Craig assumes that the only way to control population sizes is by killing individuals within that population. No mention of any other methods that God might have available to him. But also, was it not within God's capabilities to make it so that insects and wild animals just eat different things? We need predators, says Dr. Craig, because otherwise nobody eats the insects, and the insects will eat all of the predators' food, and the predators will die. Yeah, as if it literally wasn't possible for God to provide different food for wild animals and insects. The only reason this problem even exists in the first place is because of the way the ecosystem has been designed. You can't just say God needs predators because he designed a world that needs predators. That doesn't explain anything. And to reiterate, even if the animals really do need to be preyed upon for whatever reason, the process could have been made a lot less painful. But it wasn't. Now, pause. Think about this. What would we expect to find if we assume that there is no God, and animals in nature are just randomly mutating and evolving and competing for resources with no divine guidance? Well, we'd expect pretty much exactly what we observe in the real world. A messy bloodbath and a struggle for survival. And what would we expect to see if we assumed the existence of an all-loving and all-powerful God? Maybe some level of suffering that we might not be able to fully explain, but nothing even remotely approaching the level of horror and pain that actually exists in the natural world. It is incalculably easier to account for this suffering on an atheistic worldview.
Now, let me say one other thing, however, that is a result of recent scientific discoveries that shed remarkable light on the problem of animal suffering. In his book, Nature Red in Tooth and Claw, published by Oxford University Press, Michael Murray explains that there is really a threefold hierarchy of pain awareness. On the most fundamental level, there is simply the reaction to stimuli, such as an amoeba exhibits when you poke it with a needle. It doesn't really feel pain. There's a second level of pain awareness, which sentient animals have, which is an experience of pain. And animals like horses, dogs, and cats would experience this second level pain awareness. But they do not experience a third level pain awareness, which is the awareness of second order pain. That is the awareness that one is himself in pain. For that sort of pain awareness requires self-awareness. And this is centered in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, a section of the brain that is missing in all animals except for the higher primates and human beings. And therefore, even though animals are in pain, they aren't aware of it. They don't have this third order pain awareness. They are not aware of pain, and therefore they do not suffer as human beings do.
It is difficult to express just how disturbing it is to see people still peddling this Cartesian fantasy that animals don't experience pain. What exactly is it to be in pain? Pain is an experience. It's not a thing you can touch or measure. It's something that exists in the minds of conscious creatures. You cannot be in pain without being aware that you're in pain. If you're not aware of any pain, that just means you're not in pain. Pain is an experienced phenomenon by definition. If you're not experiencing it, it's not there. If pain doesn't necessitate the experience of pain in this way, then what is pain? Does it just mean damage or something's natural function being inhibited? Well, this would mean that a table is in pain if I take an axe to it. No, to suffer is to experience suffering. Saying that you can feel pain without being aware of it is like saying that you can feel sad whilst thinking that you're really happy. No, if you feel happy, that's what it means to be happy. You can't be happy if you're not feeling happy. And you can't be in pain if you don't feel that pain. To deny that animals can feel pain is a desperate excuse to justify animal suffering. It doesn't explain animal suffering, it simply denies its existence. But it gets even worse, right? Let's just say, for argument's sake, that Craig is correct. Animals don't suffer. They're not aware of any pain that they're ever in. This has some radical implications, right? If animals don't suffer, then there's no issue doing things to them that appear to cause suffering. So if I have a dog, there's no reason why I shouldn't throw that dog on a fire, cut off its tail, and poke its eyeballs out with a fork. I mean, why not? The dog isn't suffering, so what's the problem? The dog isn't aware of any pain. If you want to accept Craig's position here, you have to say that it's perfectly okay for us to treat animals in literally any way we please, since they literally cannot be harmed. Craig says he is an animal lover.
Now, this is a tremendous comfort to those of us who are animal lovers, like myself, or to pet owners. Even though your dog or your cat may be in pain, it really isn't aware of being in pain, and therefore it doesn't suffer as you would when you are in pain.
So I can't help but wonder, does Craig think that it's okay for me to torture dogs and cats? I'd imagine he'd say no, but if animals genuinely can't suffer, then there seems to be no reason why I shouldn't be able to do this. If animals can't suffer, then there's as much harm involved in me torturing them as there is in me chopping down a tree. So, do you think that it's okay for me to throw a dog onto a fire? I didn't think so. And if you don't, it must be because you can see right through this sinister nonsense about animals being incapable of suffering. It's time to relegate that ridiculous and untenable position to the history books, a stain on the course of moral progress. And if Christianity really can't come up with a better response to the problem of animal suffering, then I'm afraid to say that it should be relegated to the history books as well. I've been Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic. Make sure to follow me on social media for more content and exclusive posts. I also want to take a moment to thank my supporters on...
All right, so let's get rid of you, and let's get to it. Okay, so with a better explanation, just finish this off quickly. It's bunk. All right. Okay, so first of all, I agree that this is actually a super hard objection. Crucially, and I think I like that Cosmic Skeptic made this distinction, it's not hard to reconcile the existence of a god, or even an all-powerful god, with the existence of mass animal suffering in nature. It's difficult to reconcile it with a loving god, and that's tricky. So there are two ways we can go about this. We can try to explain it by reference to some other good that counterbalances all of that suffering, and that seems to me really difficult to do. That's like a philosophically and a historically difficult problem to figure out. Then there's another way to go about it, which introduces its own set of problems. So what you can do then is you can interrogate, well, what is meant by all-loving in this case? And the problem is that you may end up thinking the lovingness of an all-powerful God, or the all-lovingness of an all-powerful God, in terms that make that lovingness itself sort of unintelligible to us when we compare it to like what we think of as love. So like maybe God loves animals, but he loves them at the level of sort of the species or the process, or maybe of the emergence of certain levels and types of experience or consciousness in certain animals, like human beings. But then this starts to become meaningless to us because we aren't our species. And so if we're like, if we're trying to sell the idea, if we're trying to argue for the idea that God is all loving, well, that's really difficult. That's a really difficult sell when what you mean is actually all of you are dispensable I just love this emergence from this human mass or this animal mass. If that makes sense. So he's absolutely right. This is a huge, huge problem. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is that now we can be charged with being too anthropocentric. We are privileging concepts of love and of justice, say, or even like a scale of suffering that is directly built upon our own experience and our own preferences as human beings. But you don't dodge the problem of the whole thing being unintelligible then. So that's hard. Novins in Hosek says, why is God obligated to answer to mortals' demands and please them for their abstract notion of suffering? Well, he wouldn't be, but the problem is that Christianity doesn't just say that there is a being called God who has every right to do whatever he pleases. They also say he has particular qualities. And one of them is that he is all-loving, as well as all-merciful. And the problem is that when we look at nature, and this is what Cosmic Skeptic is pointing to, even nature outside of the domain of mankind, even nature untouched by mankind, is subject to immense and brutal suffering. So that's a serious problem. Human love or divine love? Well, that's the question. If we say, well, God's divine love operates differently, well, we run into a bit of a problem because, well, what do we mean by love then? We're still ascribing like a term to it that has that has like connotations for a reason. We aren't saying that God is all loving because God has some inscrutable end in the world that has nothing to do with the well-being or anything of these things that he supposedly loves. Right? So that's a little bit strange. So I think he's on point in treating this as a serious problem. And then in terms of... Now, this one gets a little bit more suspect. So why is animal suffering important to animal life defined by pain? Right. So he argues that animal suffering is important by reference to how much more of it there is. We'll get into whether or not animals suffer in the second part. That's a hairier issue. But there's a couple of issues with this. So on the one hand, regardless of whether or not animal suffering is more or less important than human suffering, or human pain, either or, it still stands as a strong objection, for the simple reason that, well, it's still there, right? Like it's something that seems, on one mode of analysis, that if you're a loving being and you have all-powerful and if you have all of the power and ability to frame the world as you see fit, such that the world at every level, at the level of the laws that dictate its structure and the things that happen within it, is up to your choosing, why would you do so in a way that includes the horrendous suffering of beings that, at the very minimum, the Bible says God called good when he created them, right? So that still stands. Now, here's a question. Does the aggregate matter? Does the amount of individual suffering matter? Because that's really what's at stake here. Because we could like really simplify this and just remove the numbers entirely. We could have a world in which there is one human and, let's say, one fox. And the fox is forever and ever being roasted over a spit, just enough that it won't die, but will still be in tremendous suffering for... Sorry, I realize that's very colorful. But will endure a tremendous amount of suffering, while the human will be relatively uncomfortable and disturbed by the display, but will otherwise be fine. Whose suffering matters more? I don't really know how to answer this except by arbitrarily privileging certain aspects of the human. So, for example, rationality, things like that. you can still ask the question, okay, well, what kind of being would make such a world in which this kind of thing takes place? And can a being that chooses this be described as loving? Now, again, there's two ways to approach this. We can interrogate what is meant by loving, such that it can accommodate that, or we can say, well, there's some other end that's inscrutable to us, and that's a possibility, crucially. But the problem is that we have a huge amount of difficulty in arguing for that. So, I mean, my stance is, just because of the nature of the problem, is I don't frickin' know. But he's absolutely right. This is a huge problem. So you can go, how can God permit this, or why can God permit this? Why can God permit this? So crucially, I don't think it's appropriate to say that God has to abide by morality. Because again, like, God is supposedly outside of the world, which should include whatever is ought in the world, if indeed there is anything that's ought in the world. But we don't need to actually take a moral approach to this, because again, the argument isn't against God per se. The argument is against a loving God. Northern Observer says, let's take a different approach. Isn't a skeptic viewing the animal kingdom as not loving speciesist? How does he know animals see it as not loving? Maybe animals are okay with it and we can never know. I think it's a justified inference that animals are not okay with being ripped to pieces by a lion, and a lion is not okay with, as I saw in a horrific documentary the other day, getting its jaw bitten off by a hippo and being forced to thirst to death by the watering hole. Is Cosmic Skeptic a moral realist? I have no idea. So, crucially, like, we can talk about moral progress in a limited sense, where we simply say that, well, we have an advanced system of what we call morality that doesn't necessarily have cosmic significance, that we've developed over time, and this is something worth maintaining and caring about, because it's a hard-gotten gain, right? Right. Okay, and as we see, apologists have responses. The problem that Cosmic Skeptic points out is that these responses don't apply to non-humans. Well, obviously one of them does, because we're gonna bring that one up in a moment. Evil and suffering result from human free will, doesn't account for suffering caused by accidents in nature. This works under a specific presumption that is not consistent with all forms of Christian belief. So, for example, there are people, I don't know the actual names of these sects and whatnot, but there are people who regard the state of the world such that it requires the kind of brutality that we see in nature. These people attribute that to a radical shift in reality that came with the fall. So with the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I don't necessarily buy this, but there are premises that actually do, in fact, attribute animal suffering to the actions of human beings. Same with afterlife arguments compensating animals. Now, I don't think Craig actually argues that animals are resurrected with human beings. But again, like, I don't see any hard reason to take a stance on this one. I mean, it assumes too much to make a definitive statement either way. Like, I could be skeptical of the idea that there is a soul substance within individual animals such that they could be resurrected in a coherent sense, or that there is some, like, soul space where dead creatures go. I don't know. This whole question is just so underdetermined. And then, okay, so sometimes we justify suffering by referring to the extrinsic goods that result from it. Hud Hudson has a really good talk on the problem of evil where he points out that unless you have a really necessary connection between the good and the suffering that supposedly produced it, that doesn't really help your argument, because you still can ask of God, why did he choose the painful route to the good? I think I actually used that language. Yeah, why take painful route down here? Whoop! Well, we lost it. Where are we? Let's go down. I think I'm here. Okay. Yes. Good. Okay, we didn't lose it. Why would you take the painful route unnecessarily to the good? And again, like, there could be reasons for this. There could be reasons that are inscrutable to us, but these don't help us in an argument. At that point, you just have to be totally agnostic, which isn't helpful if you're trying to argue for the truth of a statement about a thing. In this case, God, or the fact of God's lovingness, perhaps. So what good emerges from animal suffering? We can say obviously no, none. At least none for us that we are aware of. And we know of none for the animals, except potentially the balancing of a system, of an ecosystem, that permits a large aggregate of animals to flourish, or at least to live, or a larger aggregate of animals to flourish than if there was no animal suffering. But then again, that bridge premise isn't there. You need an explanation for why this pain is necessary. And I don't see one. Because again, like, we're talking about the choices of, supposedly, the decisions of a being that has an inclination to a particular, supposedly an inclination to a particular attitude towards his creations, so love. And he has the power to define the terms of the world however he sees fit. So these two together, again, like, you ask, well, why? It's not a matter of, well, we have, within the context of an ecosystem, or of ecosystems, or of life as we see it on Earth today, what must be done. What must be done is solely up to the discretion of this being. Does that make sense? And then again, like, you have to, at the end of all of it, you have to weigh it up. Is the aggregate good that results, or are the individual goods of such a quality that result? Does that make sense grammatically? If the goods that result are not greater than the evils that produce them, you still have a problem. It's like, yeah, sure, this evil produced this good, but it would have been better, all things considered, if you had just not done any of it at all. Now, again, like, maybe there's other goals, or maybe other goods that are beyond us, but this becomes very difficult to square with the claim that God is all-loving. Otto Eldari, I hope I got your name right, says, the problem here is that you can no longer define God in a reasonable way, so there is no thing a God would do that an evil God would not do, if he has sufficient reason to do so. Yeah. Or that an evil demon wouldn't, sorry, I should say. But, I mean, potato at this stage. Also, that goodness or badness can even be measured, in other words, is a total mess. Is there an objective method of measuring it? Is it tested? Obviously not. So, yeah. Yeah. Alright. Let's keep going. There's a few more bits here. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. So, Craig makes an interesting move here. I don't think this is... I didn't find this argument that serious. Similar logic, pardon me, can be applied to humans. Just because, again, like, we're assuming a different vantage than what we would when we apply things to balancing human ecosystems. But Craig does something really interesting here. So he tries to undercut... Let's get this... Let's put this on its own page so it's more clear. So Craig tries to undercut the question of animal suffering by saying, well, in point of fact, when we actually consider suffering, we see that, well, while lower forms of life do experience pain, they don't really experience what we would call suffering. So an awareness of second-order pain, and I would add to this, an awareness of second-order pain in time. And there is something to this in the sense that, say, a dog, say, that's being tortured, doesn't have an awareness of the future duration of that suffering, or necessarily of the length of the past duration of that suffering, or the extrinsic costs that that suffering incurs. So to that extent, there is a relevant distinction being made between 2 and 3 here. Now the question is, what is it doing to demote this, therefore, from suffering? Because there's a really good book, actually, I was kind of gratified that PhilosophyTube referenced this in her latest video. There's a really good book by Sarah Ahmed called The Cultural Politics of Emotion, and she talks about... Oh wait, no, I'm not thinking of that one. I'm thinking of Iris Murdoch, but that's also a very good book. So Iris Murdoch talks about how when you're sick or in pain, for example... Oh, and no, actually, I tell a lie. Sarah Ahmed and Iris Murdoch both talk about this. So they talk about how when you experience pain or sickness, your experience of other things sort of fades away and your attention closes in on the specific cause of suffering, or the specific suffering, or whatever, or the specific pain. So that, well, yes, human beings do also experience awareness of that second-order pain at a certain level. At a certain level of suffering, we also cease to. So, for example, if you have your leg cut off, and you are in extreme pain from that, but not enough pain that you're passing out or unable to function in other ways, you can suffer terribly. You can be aware of that pain, aware that it's not going to go away, aware of all of the things that you're losing out on as a result of that suffering. However, if you're, for example, being burned alive, you might not be aware of those extrinsic things at all. All that matters is the pain. And yet, would we therefore regard that as not suffering? I'm not comfortable with that distinction as that's being made. And there's the additional problem of, well, how do we determine that that 2 is actually true? That animals only experience pain and don't actually have a concept of how far into the future it will go. Now, of course, I don't think it's correct to say that animals have an abstract sense of time, but an animal may be at some primitive level aware that this source of suffering isn't going away, or isn't going to go away. Like, animals can panic. And again, I think it doesn't just artificially demote this. It artificially elevates this. Because again, to what extent do we actually have that self-awareness that elevates our pain to suffering? It seems to be highly contingent on factors that we would not actually in practice use to distinguish between... I mean, we can do so analytically, we can just say that it's the case. But it seems that we use the word suffering to connote something that sort of demands our attention in such a way that demoting that term is antithetical to. So then we get into the question of what is pain, what is suffering. Can you be in pain with it? Now, Cosmic Skeptic makes a bit of... I don't like how he treats this here, because he ignores the distinction that Craig is bringing up, and he doesn't really interrogate it properly. So he just equivocates between pain and suffering and stops there, but you can't really do that, because he's introduced a distinction, and it's a substantive distinction. The question is, does it actually apply? Not whether or not the distinction between pain and suffering that he gives is in some sense valid, which I think it is. I think there is like a different kind of thing that happens when you are aware of your suffering at a certain level in time, but I don't think I would use that to say that therefore. So it's doing a double action. It's saying that therefore animals don't suffer, quote unquote, but it's using that also to justify their pain. It's not clear to me that their pain is therefore justified by the bare fact that human beings have what he considers to be a higher level of suffering. Does that make sense? But Cosmic Skeptic seems to just equate suffering with pain. He's just incredulous at the distinction, and he just kind of runs with that. So that's frustrating, because there was actually a very strong critique, I think, to be made of Craig's position that he just sort of misses. Can you be in pain without being aware? Oh, right, okay. Yeah. So he equivocates between pain and suffering, between the experience of pain with suffering. And I mean, like, this is fair. Because again, like, what I think he's pinpointing here is that the animals still have some level of awareness of something really bad happening that is intolerable at a visceral level, and that this is bad. I think that's the crucial distinction that's being made here. The reason why Craig is bothering to introduce this hierarchy of pain awareness in the first place is to justify this, i.e., to make this less bad. But it doesn't seem to succeed at doing that, because this seems to be just an arbitrary... this seems to be demoted below this fairly arbitrarily. Because if we're especially if we're operating from like the level of talking about God's inscrutable extrinsic motives, why would this distinction matter to him specifically? Now, maybe there's an answer to that, but he didn't give that. So, and I don't know what that would be. Maybe a preference for rational creatures, perhaps, but again, like, it all seems rather arbitrary. And again, it doesn't get over the problem, because you're still guilty of getting, like, not guilty per se, obviously, because we're talking about God, but you still can be asked, well, why are you taking the painful route that involves this in the first place? Why is any of this necessary? Because what Craig is doing with this distinction is, in fact, demoting the pain of animals to this, in effect, in terms of its ethical significance. That's why he thinks, oh, it's great for animal lovers. They can't feel suffering, really. Which, I mean, I guess, but I don't think extreme pain is necessarily better than a little bit of suffering. So when he calls it a desperate excuse to explain animal suffering, I'm actually forced to agree. Because it is a desperate excuse. It's a terrible, terrible argument on Craig's part. I'm actually kind of baffled that he makes it. And this is sort of tautologist, so I when he says to suffer is to experience suffering, if you're suffering, you're suffering. Yeah, so this is just, again, to equivocate between this more abstract or detailed... that's the wrong word. This more specified understanding of suffering from pain generally. Which kind of begs the question, because again, like, these levels are distinguished by levels of awareness. He's just flattening all awareness to immediate awareness. And then this seems sort of beside the point, so we'll have to develop this a little bit. So, assuming Murray's distinction, specifically the distinction between suffering and pain, such that animal pain is demoted below suffering, he suggests that this would seem to imply that it's okay to torture dogs and cats, or animals, non-human animals generally, with the exception, of course, I think Craig mentioned this, of primates, for some reason. You know, even though, again, like, primates are subject to all the same animal pain that was talked about before. So that's a little bit... I mean, glad he elevates primates at least, but still. But is this true? Does this imply that it's okay to torture dogs and cats? I don't think so, because, again, like, I don't think it necessarily implies that, for the simple reason that this is, again, explaining a distinction between levels of awareness of pain, not permissiveness of inflicting to, right? So the bare fact that there is a distinction between an awareness of second-order pain, that being suffering, and sort of the raw experience of pain that animals feel. I don't know if I want to use the word raw experience, I think it's loaded, but the experience of pain that animals have, that doesn't involve an outside awareness of that pain and of its consequences over time and of its duration, things like that. That by itself is not an argument in favor of making the infliction of two permissible. And then, of course, extrinsic arguments are often brought in. It's like, well, maybe it's not actually causing suffering, quote unquote, but it's also degrading the person who does it. I don't think that's really relevant in this case. Again, because disturbingly, you can then take this and refer this back to the previous question about, well, why take the painful route? Why structure the world such that this is a necessity? Because it would seem then that, in a certain sense, God is also the cause of that animal's suffering, assuming that we don't argue, as some religious people do, that evil and suffering in the animal kingdom, as well as within humanity, is the consequence of mankind's sins, right? That strikes me as a difficult claim to sustain. You can posture it, but I don't know how you'd argue in favor of it. Okay. So, if Christianity can't come up with a better explanation, it's bunk. I'm not entirely convinced of this. However, it does pose a serious problem if you're trying to, again, positively argue for a loving God by reference to the world. It seems that at a certain level you'd just be asserting it. I think you could just say, you could say respectably that you just don't know, and it's an inscrutable, intractable problem that you're fighting with, but yeah. I mean, there's other ways to approach it as well, right? That obviate the problem. And I'm not endorsing any of these, and I'm sort of running with these off the top of my head. But for example, depending on, like, if you wanted to invoke things like Scripture, for example, you could say that, well, in Revelation it describes the old earth and the old heaven dying away. And this would seem to imply basically a total erasure of the world as it is, and the creation of a new one. Well, I mean, how weird we want to go with this, maybe it could be the idea of a sort of a world reset, in which all of the bad things attributable to sin or the structure of the world are simply cancelled out. Although that introduces a whole host of other problems specifically for Christianity, because now you have the necessity of redemption in this world, or of the significance of sin with respect to whether or not you are resurrected in the next one, or in fact, what is resurrected in the next one, because individual human lives aren't simply individual human lives are also contingently the product of that sin. Things that we do affect who we reproduce with, who gets created, right? So why would it be a one-to-one relation with people in the new world and people in the old one, such that people in the old world are resurrected in the new world? Why wouldn't it just be a whole new set of people? Or a whole new set of animals? Like, why invoke a resurrection between the old world and the new world? yeah, so that is a problem. Why is the natural world so cruel, from disease, earthquakes, etc.? Christian apologists argue evil is from other people, not God. What about the cruelty of nature? So, yeah. I think he's fairly on point with this video. I don't think it's like, again, the thing is, the answer to this question is so far beyond our capacity to actually determine in a meaningful way that I don't think this really goes one way or the other. And all of those other things, like it could simply be true that love is the wrong word, that there's something else going on, right? And we use love either insufficiently or metaphorically for something else that has no correlate in human experience. Or, if you want to be really weird about it, you could say something to the effect of God's love only exists in a sense that we understand it through physical incarnations of God in the world. Whatever that means, that's a whole other issue. But for example, let's say you assume that God actually did materialize as a human man in history, and therefore had like human emotions and things. Well, that would be a way in which God could have specifically a love for humanity while the rest of nature sort of stays the way it is. Like, it's possible also that God simply just doesn't love the rest of the world. So we just don't know. Like, again, what we're ultimately trying to do is reconcile the statements of a text by non-philosophers with a serious philosophical problem. And the language of those texts, regardless of what you think about them, probably shouldn't be expected to necessarily be accommodating to that, in the same way that you wouldn't properly treat Genesis as a science textbook, because an ancient Hebrew wouldn't want a science textbook or have any concept of what a science textbook was. Their motives for writing that book would probably be different than just a need to explain where the world came from. If they needed a way to explain where the world came from, well, those exist all over the place. They could have adopted anyone else's. Instead, they adopted one specifically that downgrades the gods of other tribes. So, obviously, if there is any sort of goal that remains in the text as it is given to us today, that was that motivated its creation when it was first composed, it isn't for the sake of, it isn't to fill like a scientific void in the Hebrew understanding of the world. There were other reasons, but yeah. Man, Craig's arguments are really bad. Like, they're really bad. Like, he handles himself well when he's against someone like Sam Harris, whose arguments are amazingly even worse. But like, damn. Like, let's think about this for a second. What does this achieve? Because he hasn't actually argued that animals don't experience a massive aggregate of pain. He's just said, well, because we experience a higher level of pain, therefore, like, what? This pain doesn't matter? That's not implied by this. And then, in another breath, you'll argue for the existence of objective moral values that seem to belie our capacity to inflict this. I don't know. I mean, like, again, like, you can be fair and, again, like, say something to the effect of, well, objective moral values to which we are beholden to, but not God. But then you have to ask again, well, but why? Because you aren't just arguing when you're arguing specifically for Christianity, for the existence of a God. You're arguing for the existence of a loving God. And you can probably do that. I don't know how convincing it would be, but you can probably do that. But this doesn't even try. Alright, well, I guess that's that. If anybody has any questions very quickly before I shut off, put an asterisk next to it. An asterisk next to it, pardon. And I'll try to get through this quickly. But yeah. Cosmic Skeptic is a trained theologian, isn't he? I understood that he actually took theology. I don't know why he would take theology. He would have been better served taking philosophy, in my opinion. But, oh, why does the Council of Days link not work? So, I don't know what's going on with that. I have updated the link multiple times now to be non-expiring, and every single time I go back, it says it's expired. So, I'm just, for the time being, I'm just going to be updating the links under the video as I upload them. Oh, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. But, yeah, so you can also reach out to me on Twitter, and I'll give you a link there. But, yeah. Cool Stuff asks, President Sunday, are you an atheist? No, I'm not. I am Christian/agnostic. And I don't see any other questions, so I think I'll call it there. Oh, here we go. Craig's apologetics take a downturn whenever it comes to ethics. His defense of the Canaanite genocide was appalling. I'd like to see you review his debate with Shelley Kagan sometime. Actually, I would really like that. I'd like to do that. Yeah, maybe that'll be one of my next ones. I just don't want to do... I don't want to do, like, Vosh debates about socialism again. Or stuff like that. Because it seems like... It seems like lefty Twitter is incapable of having an argument about socialism that doesn't devolve into arguing for worker co-ops. It's just, it's really lame, it's boring, it's circuitous, and it's not arguing for socialism. So. Cool Stuff says, really, you seemed atheistic. Okay, so this is something interesting biographically. So, when I was growing up, I would be, like, I'd watch this stuff online, of course. I would be extremely skeptical of anybody who took a, shall we say, a critical attitude or a scrutinizing attitude towards claims made by Christian apologists or by the Bible, say, if taken as, like, definitive philosophical statements. I would treat that with extreme suspicion. For the reason that I would self-reflect, and I would say, well, the reason why, and I would determine that the reason why I wouldn't be skeptical in that way is because I have a respect and a love for this thing such that I would just assume that, let's say, if I don't understand a passage from the Bible, that the failure is on my end and I need to study it more. And as a result of that, as a result of perhaps an excess of respect, I ended up having a fairly good and critical acquaintance with the text after a while. Not the whole thing, of course, but with a good, solid portion of it. So there's a positive to that, but the negative side is I became hostile to thinkers, or I become suspicious of thinkers, even treating them as closet atheists, on the grounds that they didn't share my relatively uneducated attitude towards these things. And the fact of the matter is, there are a lot of big questions that are simply unanswerable by us. And I think to a certain extent, you have to be brave enough to acknowledge that. So I'd like to think that's where I am. So I'm not an atheist, because that's a positive sentence, a statement that I wouldn't assert. I don't buy the idea that atheism is simply a disbelief in the existence of a God. It seems to come with an attitude of asserting that no such God exists. And I mean, again, like we've seen that there are strong arguments for that. So I'm not like dissing atheists for having that attitude, not strong arguments for that. There are strong reasons to suspect that as a possibility, at least with respect to God as described by Christianity. But yeah, like you can analyze things in this way and still be a Christian and still believe in this stuff and still have a deep respect and even a love for elements of Christian faith. So there's something in Kant. I'm trying to remember what the actual language is, but he talks about how. So this is from his critique of pure reason. Despite the fact that traditional metaphysics is basically bunk, it tries to extend pure reason beyond what our real capacities to know. Nonetheless, some of its findings are inevitable and, in fact, extremely good and useful and should be treated with respect. And these include things like morality, justice, the existence of God, things like that. So, I don't know. I'm tired, so I'm kind of rambling at this point, but I think that I don't think taking a critical eye to this entails abandoning your loyalty, if that makes sense. It may just require an extra measure of humility, where you are willing to be your humility and courage, I think, where you're willing to accept that you could be wrong, that there are very serious reasons to suspect that you may very well be wrong, and yet push through. Like with like, unless you actually have like a definitive statement proving you're wrong, to push through then is foolish. But I haven't seen that yet, and I have extrinsic reasons to continue to identify as that, to continue to believe in that. I don't promote in a certain sense because it's doing extra things that I don't necessarily want to be culpable for. Promoting Christianity, TM. So I don't do that, but I absolutely have a deep... Even like when I criticize like reactionaries and whatnot who refer back to Aristotle and Aquinas, like I have a deep respect for Aristotle and Aquinas. Aristotle was my introduction to philosophy, for God's sake. Bob Obb, thank you very much for the $5. It's very kind of you. Says, I understand the emotional arguments against pain, but it doesn't follow from cold logic that pain destroys the concept of a loving God. No. Again, like I would not regard what Cosmic Skeptic has given us here as a definitive argument against the concept of a loving God. It's just a problem. It is a big problem. I even think that he's probably correct in asserting that it is Christianity's biggest problem. But it is just a problem. The problem has not been resolved yet. It may never be resolved. It may not be resolvable. I'm probably falling into that fence, behind that fence. But, yeah, you're correct. It doesn't follow logically that the existence of pain destroys the concept of a loving God. The problems come in is that, well, whence the pain then, if a loving God? And you can answer that, but. Certainly the answer given by Craig here is not compelling. Novins and Hosick asks, President Sunday, would you do something regarding inner socialist debates over methods and tactics rather than co-ops versus traditional private property? I would love to, if I could find one. Feel free to shoot me a link on Twitter for a recommendation. Oh God, Darth Dawkins. What would even happen if I had Darth Dawkins on? That awful creature. I think Cosmic Skeptic is smart, but it seems he hasn't really dived deep into philosophy past the likes of mainstream philosophers' questions. I haven't watched enough to know. He does seem pretty intelligent. I think his conversation with Perspective Philosophy was actually pretty good, and I'm realizing just how prejudiced I was against these people for the longest time, because he's actually a fairly smart cookie. He's not... Cosmic Skeptic, I think he has some really shallow positions on things, but he's not stupid. I would not regard this guy as stupid at all. Or would you do Galloway versus Hitchens? Maybe. Although Hitchens is actually terrible. Hitchens has a beautiful voice and an ugly brain. Wonderful asks, President Sunday, would you consider the concept of the soul as an axiom of Christian or monotheistic thought? If so, then how would you reject its existence? I don't see why it would be an axiom of Christian or monotheistic thought. For example, like substance dualism isn't as old as Christianity, right? In fact, when you look at the Old Testament, the Hebrews regard Sheol as a place of absolute no knowledge or awareness. And then, of course, there are other questions, like maybe you reject dualism entirely and still, like, that doesn't affect the existence of God. So, for example, Immanuel Kant argues that, well, maybe his dualism of the distinction between the real and the representation of the world, sorry, the reality of the world and its presentations, the way we experience it, we may experience, for example, a distinction between body and mind that seems intuitively true. But maybe they're actually linked in a way that we just can't see in the actual world, the noumenal world, that's sort of beyond the reach of our capacity to empirically verify or even necessarily know through reason fully, if that makes sense. Bob Up again, thank you for the $5. The traditional Catholic Orthodox concept of redemptive suffering, I think, is close to answering the pain problem. Redemptive suffering. That is close to answering the pain problem for sinful man. But what about for animals? That's the question, right? Now, perhaps, again, this is obviated in some referred afterlife or something like that, or another created world. But that's very difficult to defend. That's very difficult to defend. So I take your point with respect to human pain. I don't think that works for the question here. Unless you want to say something really weird, like just as the fall of mankind corrupted the world and brought pain into the animal world as well as into the human world, man's redemption also repairs that. That's weird. I think I've actually heard somebody argue that, and that's interesting. But it's also like weirdly anti-realist about the natural world, which I don't like. What happened to the King Crocoduck video? Hopefully we'll be doing that actually tonight. So what happened was I tried for the first time to have a guest through Discord on OBS, and so two things happened. First of all, my guest's, Jama Bayarn's mic was not working properly in conjunction with their earphones. So, because his earphones weren't working with the mic plugged in or with the mic sort of prioritized, if we were talking with the video playing, you'd hear the video echoing from his side. But if he put the earphones in, then it turned off the mic, so you couldn't hear him speak. So yeah, so we're going to try it again tonight on FaceTime, and we may possibly have Shruggy with us as well, which is great, because he's also really big in philosophy of science, so. Parador the 14th, or the 14th, sorry, my vision's so blurry right now from pollen. The 14th asks, is there any YouTube apologist reactionary you have some respect for, or do all suck? Yes, Hud Hudson is great. It's been a long time, but I think I remember, oh shoot, what's his name? It's Peter something. Hang on, let me find this quickly. No, wait. It's, I can't remember his name, but there was another guy. A really old guy who's somehow still alive. But yeah, Hud Hudson is fantastic. There's a physicist that he recommends whose name I also can't remember. Man, am I having a stroke? I can't remember anybody's names today. Cool Stuff asks, do you know the channel Political Philosophy, Dr. Laurie Johnson? I do not, but I'm interested. I'll give that a look. Monarch Blue asks, some time ago you made a poll about whether your next videos would be about Edward Phaser, how WLC is unconvincing, and how non-Christians do Christian-themed stuff better than Christians. Any progress? I sort of addressed that with a couple of my videos. I haven't done the WLC one specifically. I may do that in the near future. But I'm trying to like structure my year, and I realize that I've already fallen off the schedule, but I'm still trying to adhere to it somewhat. Like with the Peterson thing, I have to go back and I have to do that still. But I'm trying not to limit myself to a particular theme, especially like apologetics related, because I'm not strictly speaking a channel concerned with apologetics and religion, although I'm also concerned with that. I'm primarily a political theory channel. So. Bob says, pain might just be a necessary part of creation. Without nerves and the possibility of pain, animals would have no concept of danger or death. Aha, but there's the question. So you're assuming that they must have been created in a world that contains danger and death. Now, I mean, you could argue that maybe there are experiences or sort of like dynamics or things that have value in and of themselves that are only emergent from danger and death and pain. And that's possible. And maybe there is no positive reason to prevent a loving God from creating a world with those things. I don't know how you'd establish that, though. And again, like, if we're staying true to the letter here, that seems to go against what we think of as a loving thing. Like, when we love something, we don't think, oh, well, we will extract higher things from this thing by inflicting tremendous pain upon it. Not unless it's for the good of that thing. If you're just deriving the good, if you're just, like, taking pleasure in the existence of the thing this thing produces, well, that doesn't seem to be consistent with loving that thing. Right? All right, well, I'm losing my voice, so I'm going to call it for now. Again, we may, and I said this last night, so fingers crossed, we may be back later to talk about the King Crocoduck video. That will not be the final statement on it. I will be doing a full video essay reply once the final video in that series is out. I'm assuming it's 3 videos long. If it's more, God help me. But tonight we'll be doing kind of a blind run and just sort of talking about giving our first impressions. So I think we may just be doing the first of his videos on that. But we'll see how we do for time. So anyways, thanks everybody for watching, and take care.